You mentioned cancer at our very, very start. Cancer is one of the least heritable medical disorders, much less heritable than most behaviors. They involve DNA very
Okay.
often, mutations in DNA, but they're not inherited. Another thing I can have personal experience with is I love the sun. As you can see, I'm on holiday, so I'm kind of sunburnt now. And if you get skin cancer, that you didn't inherit that. That's a mutation, say, in my hand here, one cell got too much of the ultraviolet light or whatever, and it screwed up its duplication and made it go mad. It just uses, it's not like
Mm-hmm.
you're invaded with a virus. It uses your own reg developmental regulatory mechanisms and it disrupts them so that the cells start growing uncontrollably. That's basically what skin cancer is. But you didn't inherit that. That's an environmentally caused DNA mutation. You won't pass it on to your children. You don't pass on cells from your
Okay,
hand.
so you don't pass your genes even though those genes have mutated. So do you always pass the sort of the blueprint that was there originally, not potentially the mutations that you've picked up throughout your
Mm-hmm.
life?
No, good question. You start life as a single cell, with half the DNA from your mother, half from your father. That DNA, that same exact sequence of 3 billion base pairs of DNA, that's the steps in the spiral staircase of the double helix of DNA. So 3 billion steps. Those are the same sequences we'd find in the trillions of cells in your body. That includes your hand and your hair and your everything, brain, muscle. But all you pass on to your offspring are those cells that ended up as gametes, that is, eggs or sperm. Any mutation
Mm-hmm.
there will get passed on to your offspring, but only
Ah.
mutations there. Now, if you had a mutation you inherited from your mother, that would be there, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
it's the same sequence of DNA that you started life with. But in addition, if you had any other mutations that you picked up that affected the DNA in your sperm or eggs, that you would pass on to your offspring. But a lot of the cancers are what we call spontaneous mutations in the sense that you don't inherit them. It's just that in the first few cell divisions, you might have a mistake, and that mistake is a mutation. It doesn't have to come from the outside.
Mm-hmm.
That is, if you're replicating 3 billion steps and nucleotide bases of DNA in every single cell, every time it replicates, there's a chance a mistake is made. Now, it's incredibly reliable, but when you're talking about trillions of cells, and these cells are duplicating themselves over and over again during your life, well, the chances are you will pick up mutations. And those are spontaneous in the sense that you didn't inherit them, they're de novo. And in most cases, then, you won't pass them on. They might just be in your brain or in your heart or elsewhere. They might just affect those other organs. They might not be in your testes or ovaries. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so it's an
Okay,
important
so
distinction.
yeah, it was interesting for me in particular because I did actually have cancer when I was younger. I was diagnosed at 26, and it did it did cross my mind whether I would be potentially passing some fractured DNA to my kids. And at the time, there was no time to freeze my eggs or anything like that, so I didn't know whether I will be able to have a family. I was very lucky that I could. So I've got a son, and we've got another baby on the way.
Oh, very good.
But it was really interesting for me to even consider that, would I be passing something? And on the other sort of side of the same coin, I suppose, is epigenetics. So
Right.
this is essentially the sort of the expressions of the genes. So my understanding is that I, for example, could be carrying the set of genes that would be predisposing me to obesity. But
Mm-hmm.
if I work very hard, eat very healthily, blah, 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 I will still be, for example, quite light and on the skinny side, but the genes that I would be passing to my kids still would carry that higher probability of obesity happening. And obviously it kind of depends on how they then gel with the genetic material from the other parent, right?
Right. So that's a
So
very
the
very good point. And
epigenetics are also not heritable. Is that
well,
right?
that's exactly right. And there was a thought that there are some examples, they talk about the Dutch famine, or there's some experiments in mice that suggest that you can inherit a little bit of the epigenetic marks, they call them, from your mother, but that's pretty much discounted now. And so, as a general statement, you
Oh, okay.
don't inherit epigenetic differences. Epigenetics is just slow motion gene expression. So, your genes, people say you have 24,000 genes. It's hard to say what a gene is because it's all more complicated than the old classical model. But these genes aren't all going in all the cells. The cell, in fact, is probably there's only housekeeping genes in common. Most of the genes in your liver are expressing themselves differently. That is, different genes are being expressed in your liver because it has different functions than in your brain, say. And the point
Mm-hmm.
is that DNA evolved to give you stability across generations. So your species evolved in a certain environment, and your genes have been adapted that way in the sense of natural selection. Genes that help you in that environment, they work, and those that don't. And so there's general species-wide effects of these genes, and you transmit those faithfully from generation to generation. But then RNA, that is, DNA is coded into RNA, which is another DNA-like sequence with a little bit of a difference. And that's what goes out of the nucleus of the cell. The DNA stays in the nucleus. The RNA goes out and then codes for amino acids, which become proteins. It's everything that we are. Neurotransmitters, bone, brain, everything are these proteins that are coded by DNA. But which ones are expressed is a matter of RNA telling the DNA, okay, we need some more of this, and they allow that bit to be transcribed and translated into protein. So that's RNA evolved to be responsive to the environment. DNA evolved to
Okay.
say, this is what we need as human species, we don't mess with this. But RNA then is, I think, you can think of it as being responsive to the environment. So you were talking about obesity. So it's your RNA will say, well, wait, now I need some more sugar here. And then it would code for the proteins, enzymes that you need to metabolize sugar. And it could well motivate those very deep animal bits of your brain that say, let's eat, because we evolved. The problem with obesity is we evolved in a stone age where we have stone age brains in a fast food world. Our brains evolved at a point when if you could get food, you would eat it because you didn't know when your next meal would come. You favor genes that store fat because for that same reason, you don't know when you're going to eat again. But nowadays, in a fast food nation where you're bombarded by food cues all the time, it's actually a risk factor now, a disability for obesity,
Mm-hmm.
that you're able to store fat very well. So, so anyway, the point you're making, I think, takes us back to the idea of fatalism. And you started by saying you could have the obesity genes, but you could control your environment. So, so that you don't eat so much. And I have a high genetic propensity to obesity, and what I do is I change my environment. I just don't have junk food around, and I just make it harder for myself to get fat, because I know it's also harder for me to lose weight.